Namaskar. Welcome to another episode of Editorial. I've got a very interesting episode for you today. Yesterday, 23rd of April 2021, our Chief Justice, Mr. Sharad Arvind Bobde, retired. Let's talk about Mr. Sharad Arvind Bobde's legacy. What has he achieved as the Chief Justice of India? And who better to talk about this than Senior Advocate Prashant Bhushan? So that's my show today. Let's get right into the show. Sir, thank you so much for coming to my show. Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure.
My first question, I want to start from our last interview. Sir, in our last interview, you had told me that Ranjan Gogoi was possibly one of the worst CJI that India ever saw.
So far as Justice Gogoi is concerned, the sexual harassment incident happened immediately after he became Chief Justice, where he just panicked. And on a Saturday, he assembled a bench headed by himself to deal with that sexual harassment case, asked Justice Arun Mishra to be along with him, and passed some kind of absurd orders, and thereafter he constituted a bench headed by Justice Arun Mishra. And all that evidence of that sexual harassment was with the police, with the Delhi police. So therefore, thereafter, it seems that he also buckled and he gave all kinds of judgments in favor of the government, including that of the CBI director, including that of this Ayodhya case, the Rafale case, etc. And thereafter, he went on to accept a Rajya Sabha nomination. So, he is probably looked upon as the worst Chief Justice so far. That's the general perception about him.
Sir, do you maintain that or do you want to change your stance?
Well, it's not very easy to actually compare the tenure of two Chief Justices, but in the sort of steady decline that we have seen in the Supreme Court over the last four Chief Justices, I suppose that trend was still maintained even with the outgoing Chief Justice. There was no sort of major scandal associated with Chief Justice Bobde personally. But in terms of what he did or did not do, yes, perhaps he will be judged quite harshly in history. This Gautam Bhatia has written an excellent blog, which was published by The Wire today, which evaluates Chief Justice Bobde's legacy and his tenure more critically and in greater detail than what I had done in my article in The Hindu.
Sir, what's your honest view of retired Chief Justice Sharad Bobde?
No, my honest view is that unfortunately he neither in his judicial functioning nor in his administrative functioning did he acquit himself well. In fact, in his judicial functioning, he never heard some of the most important cases before us. He never heard the Kashmir cases, even the habeas corpus cases coming out of Kashmir. Or whenever he heard some of them, he deferred them usually. Then he never heard the challenges to the CAA. Then he never heard, at least for final hearing, he never heard the challenge to the electoral bonds and money bills. He never heard the main petition regarding the Rohingya refugees, and so on. There are many, many other cases, also important cases, which he never heard. And those which he did hear, he heard by way of some interim applications like the electoral bonds case or the Rohingya refugees case, where he gave some interim orders which are totally unconscionable in my view. They they are not only riddled with factual errors, they just follow whatever the government tells him uncritically. They do not even examine the arguments that were made on behalf of the petitioners, both in the electoral bonds case as well as in the Rohingya refugees case. And he passes orders which are in clear violation, at least in the Rohingya case, clear violation of all constitutional law, international law, everything. Where he says that first he questioned whether refugees can invoke Article 21 rights under the Constitution. Even a first year law student normally knows that Article 21 is available to any person. He need not be a citizen, unlike Article 19 rights, which are available only to citizens. Similarly, he he says that if there is genocide happening in Myanmar, what can we do about it? At least you cannot send refugees who are in India back to Myanmar to be slaughtered. That's against every civilized norm. That's against the Genocide Convention, so many other conventions to which India is a party. So his and the manner in which he dealt with various habeas corpus cases, like the case of Siddiq Kappan, he kept saying that, well, why are you coming directly to the Supreme Court? You go to the High Court, etc. Kept adjourning that case also. I mean, an absurd case against Siddiq Kappan, for which he has been in jail now for more than 6 months. So, judicial record was very poor. His administrative record was also almost equally bad. The Chief Justice plays several administrative roles. One is as master of roster, by which he decides which cases should be given priority, which cases should be heard on a priority, which cases to be heard by which bench, etc. In that also his record was very poor. Then he is also the prime mover in judicial appointments. He couldn't carry the rest of the collegium with him. Thereafter, when it came to even enforcing the appointments which the collegium had recommended in some of the high courts, which the government had been sitting on for months and years altogether, he couldn't even get himself to issue a direction to the government to issue those notifications. Similarly, he has other administrative roles also, because if he receives complaints against judges, he has to deal with them in the manner prescribed under the in-house procedure. He didn't do that in the case of the complaint that he received against his successor. That complaint, we don't know whether any kind of in-house committee was appointed in that case or not, whether who were the members of that in-house committee, what was the report of that committee, nothing was made known. Similarly, the manner in which he presided over that complaint against his predecessor, Chief Justice Gogoi, that sexual harassment case.
Yes.
He presided over that committee. He didn't allow that woman to bring her lawyer. He didn't allow the proceedings to be recorded. He did not even give her a copy of the report. Ultimately, he said that he has been exonerated. On what basis? Nothing was ever made known to the people. So therefore, it's a very, very unfortunate state of affairs.
Sir, specifically talking about the migrant workers. Sir, could the Supreme Court do better? In fact, there's a statement from Justice Bobde where he said that why do migrant workers need money? They're getting food in the lockdown. Sir, couldn't the court do better?
Yes, of course, the court could do better. See, the migrant workers at that point were in need of several things. One was they needed some food. Secondly, they needed some source of livelihood because they had lost their livelihood. They had lost their jobs because of. So therefore, they needed some work or at least some wages or some money in lieu of that. Then they were stranded without any transport. Many of them, in the absence of jobs, wanted to go back home, but there was no transport available to them. So at least he could have he could have passed an order for providing them with some source of livelihood, or at least some transport to their homes, to their villages, etc. But
Sir,
that also he didn't do.
my
Just preferred to believe the government statement that there was no migrant on the road.
was there a lack of apathy from the Supreme Court?
There was a lack of empathy on the part of the Chief Justice. There was a sort of almost callousness. It was bordering callousness on his part. So there was no sympathy, no empathy for the poor and the weak and the marginalized or the incarcerated whose fundamental rights were being destroyed. There was not a trace of sympathy for them.
In his entire term, not once did the recommendation committee for appointment of judges meet.
No, I think they met, but they couldn't arrive at any consensus because I think one of the issues, at least that's what was reported, was that Justice Nariman, who was in the collegium, was saying that Justice Akhil Qureshi, who is arguably the best Chief Justice in any high court in the country today, that he should be brought to the Supreme Court. And unless he is brought to the Supreme Court, he will not agree to other recommendations. This is what was reported. And apparently, since the government did not want Justice Qureshi because he had been the judge in Gujarat who had sent Amit Shah to jail, so therefore there was a kind of deadlock in the collegium.
Was Justice Bobde biased towards an ideology or towards a party?
If you see from his actions, it would appear to be so, because if you see that the kind of judgment that he gave in the Ayodhya case, of course, he was one of those 5 judges who gave that judgment, which to my mind is an unconscionable judgment, but he was party to that. If you see the fact that he issued notice on the Places of Worship Special Provisions Act, which put a lid on reopening other such disputes in the country, like the Ayodhya disputes. He issued notice on a petition challenging that. If you see that he sent the Sabrimala case for review, if you see all those things, and if you see his whole thing about going to temples all the time, incessantly, etc., one would certainly get a feeling that he was ideologically on the same page as the present government about its whole religious and anti-minority agenda. That's the impression that those judgments, etc., give us.
Sir, another point that you had raised is about locking down the Supreme Court. Sir, can we call former Chief Justice Bobde the first online Chief Justice that we ever had?
Yes, he can be called that almost, because within 3 months of his becoming Chief Justice, the Supreme Court went into a lockdown and a digital mode of functioning. And though in some ways it's good that the court also started a digital mode of functioning during his time, so that this kind of opens up the way for people to appear from remote locations, from any place in the world, etc. So that's good. But unfortunately, the result of that was that only one-fourth of the cases which are normally heard by the Supreme Court were being heard in this kind of digital mode of functioning. There's no reason why only one-fourth should be heard. Only half the benches were sitting and each bench was hearing only half the normal cases in a normal day. I mean, but there are problems, or there have been problems with digital functioning, but uh, there is no reason why more cases should not have been heard. During his time, only one-fourth cases were being heard during this digital functioning. And not only were only one-fourth cases being heard, the cases which needed to be heard were not being heard. I mean, Dushyant pointed out that he spent a lot of his time hearing this relatively inconsequential case about dispute between Tatas and Mistry and so on, when there were far more important cases which should have been accorded priority, like the Kashmir cases or the Citizenship Amendment Act cases or various habeas corpus cases, etc.
The Supreme Court had a lot of problem with what you spoke. In fact, you were made to pay a huge fine of ₹1 as a punishment. Sir, tell me yesterday rather, Chief Justice made a statement. He said freedom of speech is the most abused right.
See, it is while it is true that freedom of speech is sometimes abused to spread fake news or to spread hate, etc. That is true. But having said that, today freedom of speech is under enormous threat particularly from the government, who is treating everything said against the government to be sedition, who's targeting journalists and activists for speaking up against the government, etc. In such times, freedom of speech is in danger and needs to be protected. And for such a statement coming from the Chief Justice is very unfortunate. For him to say that this is the most abused right, etc., is most unfortunate. I mean, he failed to do the job that was entrusted to him by the Constitution. He failed to live up to the oaths that he had taken to defend the Constitution, to protect fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution, to protect freedom of speech, etc. And then he goes on and says that this is an abused right. That's very unfortunate.
Can you remember one good judgment that former Chief Justice Bobde took in his tenure?
So I had, in my Hindu article, I had given one instance of a West Bengal trees case where he appointed an expert committee to value trees in order to see whether for public projects permission to cut trees should be given or not be given and under what circumstances, etc. But there are a few other cases, or at least one or two other cases, which I forgot. One of them was about this releasing prisoners in jail during COVID times on parole. So I think that was a good order, though it was perhaps not fully followed through. So there may have been one or two other cases which I am not remembering, but there were too few and too far between and relatively inconsequential. On all consequential things, he fails.
I want to ask you a very fundamental question, sir, and I ask you this as a layperson. In India, what is more important? Is law important or is a judge important? Sir, I ask you this question is because one judge says bail is the rule and jail is the exception, and the other judge puts a comedian behind bars for a joke he was going to crack at some point in time. Sir, so what really happens for a layman that it is not about justice anymore. It is the judge that he is going to be standing in front of that makes a difference.
See, two things are happening today and both unfortunate. One, it was famously said that you show me the person who is coming before me in habeas corpus, and I'll show you the law. So if you have Arnab Goswami coming before you say that, well, he should be immediately granted bail in an overnight hearing. His case must be heard immediately. When you have some person like Siddiq Kappan coming, you say, ki, what's the urgency? Uh, let him be there in jail for some more time, or let him go back to the High Court and so on. So therefore, this is one problem. The second problem is that today this can be inverted. You show me the judge, and I'll show you what his view on the law is. That means ki the understanding of different judges on the law is not uniform. In fact, you show me the government in power and show me the face of the judge who's hearing this case, and I'll tell you what his view on the law will be. So this is unfortunate, but this is happening, and it's happening on a large scale. So law is being bent in accordance with the person who comes up. Law is being bent according to the face of the judge who's hearing the case. Law is being bent depending upon who is in power. So therefore, law is the enforcement of law, which should be strictly in accordance with the Constitution. Of course, there can be a differing opinion between judges on the law, but this kind of thing that we are seeing today, that is judges kowtowing to the government, judges bending the law according to the wishes of the government, judges bending the law depending upon how close the petitioner is to the government. This is something which is very unfortunate, but it is happening.
Sir, are we then saying that our legal justice system is completely dismantled?
Well, that's the perception that a lot of people have today.
No,
That
isn't that the truth also,
Supreme
sir?
Court.
Sir, isn't that the, I'm sorry to butt in, isn't that the truth also, sir? If you see cases, I mean, that's the truth. Arnab Goswami gets a hearing overnight, whereas others wait for months, years.
Yes, to a large extent, it is true that the Supreme Court is no longer functioning as an independent custodian of the Constitution and fundamental rights of the people and the rule of law. And it has started acting more and more as an instrumentality of the government.
Why was the oxygen case taken in by the Supreme Court? The High Court were handling it. The High Courts were giving instructions. It was being at least heard. Now the Supreme Court took the case and they have postponed the hearing to next week.
So the reason appears to be, to me, the government must have told, the Solicitor General must have made a plea to the Chief Justice that, look, there are High Courts which are giving differing orders. There will be contradictory orders. Therefore, the Supreme Court should take it up themselves. I mean, there was some sense in that. If the High Courts were indeed issuing contradictory orders, but that had not been demonstrated at all, that the High Courts were issuing contradictory orders. Therefore, in these circumstances, Supreme Court did nothing for the last 1 month since this COVID crisis or the sort of second wave has been raging. And once the High Court started doing things, started issuing orders to the various governments, etc., then the Supreme Court swings into action. And if going by the past track record of the Chief Justice Bobde, it seems that they would have then gone by what the government was wanting the courts to say. The high courts were not going by what the government wanted.
In fact, high courts were actually very responsible. Most of the statements they made were very responsible statements. They spoke about the wastage, they spoke about red tapeism in getting oxygens to states, and they spoke about lethargy, they spoke about the central government's inaction to ensure that the states get oxygen. So they were actually asking relevant questions which the common man wanted them to ask, which is why you have a court. And all that was stopped, and this entire thing was taken into Supreme Court, and Supreme Court now says we'll hear next week. So what about all the people who are going to die in the next in the next 7 days? What about them? Who will be responsible for that? And somewhere down the line here is where I say, sir, is that is our legal justice system functioning?
No, so the high courts have not stayed their hands because the Supreme Court is dealing with this case. Fortunately, the high courts are still going ahead with their hearings and are still issuing orders. Of course, it was irresponsible for the Supreme Court to have first indicated that they will take over the matter themselves and then suddenly adjourned it to Tuesday because there was public criticism of the manner in which the Supreme Court intervened in this case.
In your article in Hindu, you said that the last 5 years during the tenure of the last 4 Chief Justice of India has seen an unprecedented fall. This is what you had written, and which technically means that the fall has been seen during the government's, during the BJP NDA government's regime.
Yes, absolutely. Because this government is one which has systematically sought to destroy and subvert and suborn every independent institution, whether it's the courts, whether it is the media, whether it is the Election Commission, whether it is the Comptroller and Auditor General, the Human Rights Commissions, the Lokpal, the RBI, the CBI, the Enforcement Directorate, every institution which is supposed to be independent of the government has been suborned, subverted, and brought to its knees. And therefore, unfortunately, the judiciary, which is the most important of these independent regulatory institutions and which is supposed to hold the government accountable and enforce the constitution, enforce the rule of law, enforce fundamental rights of people, even that unfortunately has succumbed to the onslaught of the government, the Supreme Court at any rate.
Sir, before I end, just wanted to ask you this question, sir. I know this has been asked to you before. Sir, do you regret starting that movement in 2013? Do you regret the India Against Corruption movement, sir?
India Against Corruption movement? No, I don't regret starting that movement. It was needed. We do need an independent anti-corruption ombudsman like the Lokpal. And it was as a result of that movement that law was passed. It's a different matter that this government has subverted that institution by first not appointing anybody and then appointing people who are of no use, because for the last 2 years they've been sitting in a 5-star hotel doing nothing. So, but one unfortunate consequence of that movement was that the then opposition party, the BJP, and in particular Mr. Modi, took advantage of that movement to destroy the Congress party and thus ride to power. And their coming to power has been a great detriment to this country. And in that respect, I feel that the consequences, or at least this one consequence of that movement was very unfortunate.
Also, the fact that most of the corruption cases that were spoken about, sir, be it 3G, 2G case and whatever, most of the corruption cases that were spoken about turned out to be, most of them are acquitted. Raja is acquitted. Kandimuri is acquitted. So that too was somewhere down the line, as on now, it looks like a plot, isn't it?
No, it wasn't a plot. I mean, those were clearly corruption cases. But unfortunately, see, what happens is when the enforcement agencies or the investigative agencies or the prosecution agencies thereafter become weak, then people sometimes get acquitted when the climate changes or whatever. So, but they have not all been acquitted. Many trials are still pending. They have all been given bail, but they are not all acquitted. Some of them may have been acquitted, but the majority of them have not yet been acquitted.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this time.
Thank you.
Hello everyone. HW News English is 2 years old now. When we started this venture, we promised ourselves one thing, that news should remain free, because right to know is the right of every Indian. But to keep news free for everyone, we need support from some of you. And thus we have rolled out membership on our YouTube channel HW News English. But mind you, the membership is completely voluntary. The programs that we were doing earlier, that we are doing now, will continue to remain free. First level is a basic level. Here, you can be our supporter by paying Rs 199 per month. This membership gives you certain perks and benefits. The perks include unique badges in front of your name, a live show from Mr. Sujit Nair and from Mr. Akhilesh Bhargava per month for our members. You can also vote in some exclusive members-only polls. Now the second level is Super Supporter. Here you can be our Super Supporter by paying Rs 3,999 per month. This membership will include every perk that comes with basic level. Additionally, our Super Supporters can be a part of a WhatsApp group where we can have discussions and suggestions on various topics. The second perk includes a gift pack with our merchandise. And the third perk is a Google Meet with Mr. Sujit Nair, where you can join the meet and ask your questions to Mr. Nair face to face. Lastly, if you like, we would give a shout out to our super supporters in our programs. So, hope to see you soon with our badges.